There were many controversies within the church about the ordeal, particularly as the presentment jury and other trials and other trial systems in Europe began to use the ordeal more frequently. In England in particular, it looked to the church that with all the presentment juries after 1194, that you were just kind of harnessing God to a trial mechanism. And this didn't look terribly right, that you could kind of just run people through this and God would say, yes, 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 no, yes, 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 no. Okay. On the other hand, the king didn't seem to have a whole lot of problem with it. And we can come to a fair assessment of this, that didn't seem to be causing anyone in the king's government much problem until 1215. And then the church prohibited clerics from participating in ordeals. And if the priest didn't bless the pool of water, it wouldn't make any difference if you sank or floated. It was just water then. And so the ordeal just didn't make any sense. It's not that it didn't make any sense to anyone. After it had been prohibited in England, we have the record of an abbot who went ahead and did it anyway. The abbot was a traditionalist, and he just put some people to the ordeal of water, and the king's council came down on him. But the question then, how do you try people? If people had really been upset with the trial by ordeal, they would have said, hey, we've got juries. We've been using assizes and juries in property litigation now for, what, 15, almost 40 years. We'll just use the trial by jury. But no, in 1219, the king sent his justices out, and they had to figure out what to do with people that were accused of crime. And they couldn't try them. If minor offenses, let them go. If medium offenses, hold them in prison, maybe exile them. Bigger things, make sure they don't do any, really hold them in prison and don't let them do anything. You can't try them, though. This is 4 years without a mechanism for trying people. And it was only after that, fairly soon after that, about 5 years after the ordeal was prohibited, that they inserted into the process the trial jury, so that you had two juries. One, the presentment jury that said that you were suspected, and the other, the trial jury. But this wasn't as good as the ordeal, because after all, a trial jury is of men. The ordeal was of God. You could force a person to the ordeal, but there was no way that the court was going to force you to a trial of men. So you could refuse to be tried. Yeah, you got a question?
Yeah, were the people familiar with Hammurabi's code at this time?
If they were, it didn't play any role at all. One can see not only no influence from Hammurabi's code, which is very distant, but actually you cannot see any influence from Roman law, which was at this time well studied. There were specialists, doctors of Roman law in England, and Roman law was taught. It was highly sophisticated. No influence in this procedure at all. This is homegrown. Yeah.
Why did the church determine that
It was harnessing God to a process. It looked like it was almost blasphemous, expecting that you could make God answer at will. Bless the water, throw him in.
It had nothing to do with the concept of separation of church and state?
No, there is no. They had an idea that they were a separate order, that the ecclesiastics were a separate order. But that's not the same thing as a separation of church and state. Okay, there's a major problem with all of that. Let's see if the PowerPoint's actually working. I've forgotten. Can I have the, yes. England substituted the trial jury in the final form, then as a presentment jury followed by the trial jury. But unable to force people to that trial, and that presents a real problem. I say humanitarianism here. It's a bit inappropriate. But look at what happens. Late 13th century. The problem is people can just say, no, I don't want to be tried by a jury. I don't trust it. So by statute, pen forfeit dure. If you refuse to be tried by a jury, you will be taken back to prison, and you will not eat and drink on the same day. And on the day you eat, you'll eat stale bread. And on the day that you drink, you'll drink water from the nearest stagnant pool to your cell. You're not going to last very long. Okay. This system, this was an inducement, if you will, to submit to trial by jury in criminal offense. And it didn't last very long. By the early 14th century, pen forfeit dure had come to be you would be taken back to your cell and crushed to death. Okay. This is humanitarianism at its best. And I'm not just being facetious. There is a good side to this. The state needed a mechanism to try people. You had to have some way to induce people to submit to trial by jury. But no one, do you trust your fellow men that much? And the answer was no. Did they? If you thought that that jury was going to go against you, and you submitted to trial by jury, and you were right, and you were convicted, you died a felon, and your family forfeited all your lands, chattels, goods, and tenements. On the other hand, if you said, I'm not going to submit to trial, and they take you back to your cell and crush you, you die innocent, and your family keeps your land, tenements, goods, and chattels. That's not a great compromise. It requires some brutality. But there's a fairness about that. There's a fairness about that. Humanitarianism kind of in quotes and italics and bold or what have you. But look at what we've got then. I don't even know what happened there. We're basically done with that set, so this is not a major problem. After 1176, then, increasingly, England became a medieval state. It wasn't a medieval state in 1177. It became a medieval state increasingly up to about 1350, instead of just a feudal monarchy. And the way you can tell that is that it had a bureaucracy, the law, that benefited a large sector of society. Property rights, made people more free, had a criminal justice system in which people participated through juries. A lot of people participating in juries. It developed common concerns that developed loyalty not just to the person of the king, as happened in France, but to the government. So that there was a separate focus of loyalty in England. You could be loyal to the king, and many people were, but you could also be loyal, as it were, to the state apart from the king. You had a common concern, an ongoing institution that benefited you, that benefited your family after you died, that preserved the wealth and welfare of those that you felt you had to protect and provide for. That was the common law. And that common law was a bureaucratic benefit that changed people's loyalty from local concerns and lords to the state. Okay, people see why I say that in 1176 you make a transition over from a feudal monarchy to a medieval state. Having achieved a medieval state, what we're going to talk about now is moving from a medieval state to a government of inherent authority. English law on the Black Death. No lecture about the Black Death is complete without its rat. On the other hand, I'm a legal just like I'm not a wax historian, I'm not a medical historian either, so we just get rid of the rat. We're not actually going to talk a lot about the plague. What we're going to do is talk some more about those labels. And I have a very specific thesis for this part of the class, and that is that after the plague hit England in 1348 to 50, killed about 40% of the population, a demographic catastrophe by any yardstick. So after after the plague and to hold society together, the upper orders of society, can we have the slide back on? To hold society together after the plague, the upper orders united, coercing each other, and the lower orders to stand to their obligations. And so what was happening was that in the face of 40% of the people dying, the government reached out, gathered people into the government more expansively, to govern more collegially, for the purpose of coercing not just the working people, but also the magnates to do what they should, to perform their obligations well, so that society would hang together. To do this, government reached much farther down into society, much farther down into society. The first part of the 14th century hadn't been all that much fun. There was a lot of bad weather, famines, plagues, murrain, which is sheep with rotten hooves. England was basically overpopulated. For those people who survived the Black Death, it was a much better time, but for those people who died, it wasn't terribly enjoyable. To give some idea about what was happening, what you see on the screen is a count of membranes of litigation in the King's Court of Common Pleas. In the 1330s, the Court of Common Pleas, or the King's Court as a whole, had about 0.5% of the population as litigants each year. That's an immense amount. A different part, if you go over the course of 4 years, it was 2% of the whole population, different people. 2% of the population over 4 years were plaintiffs or defendants in the King's Court. Federal courts today do not have that kind of interaction with the community, right? And so what you're talking about, even in the 1330s, well before the Black Death, is a court that had a really broad effect on society, really broad effect. The large bars at the left are 1347 and 1348. The King's Court was generating, at that point, just about 1,800 membranes of sheepskin, each about a yard long, 10 inches wide, written on both sides, abbreviated medieval Latin. Each year, 1,800 membranes. 1349 is down below 500. Okay, that's just plummeting. And then it builds back up through the 1350s, and the last bars you have, the last two bars, are 1371 and 1380. Okay? So you can see that by 1380, there's even more litigation than there had been, right? But if you compare what historians think the population was to those numbers of membranes of litigation, what you see is that the population hadn't recovered. The population had stayed down about 50% of what it had been, but the litigation is about double. There's about twice as much litigation per person by 1380 as there had been in 1347. This is a wonderful graph, isn't it? It shows graphically that something really major had happened in society. And that something major had to do with law. It also had to do with dying people, but we're interested in the law part of it. Any questions about that graph? It's actually quite startling. It's actually quite startling. Okay, so with that introduction, kind of having convinced you that something really major here, and this isn't a transitory phenomenon, the litigation stays about that frequency, and the population stays depressed. And so you're looking at a major long-term change. So let's look at that thesis. That is that after the Black Death, to hold society together, the king's government united the upper orders of society, earls, bishops, barons, knights, united those orders together in governance to coerce each other and the lower orders to perform their obligations. We're talking about a government then that is much more aggressively going out into society and trying to control it, hold it together from collapsing in the face of a demographic catastrophe. So, How do you unite the upper orders? We're going to talk about basically three things. One is labor regulation by the state. We'll talk about each of these in more detail. I'm just running through them rapidly at this point. Labor regulation by the state, in which the regulation is going to be not according to a person's free or unfree status, but rather by contract. We're going to talk about the statute of treasons in 1352, the first definition of treason in Anglo-American law, and a resolution of church-state conflict that one finds with the statute of provisors in 1351 and the statute of praemunire in 1353. We're going to talk about each of those now in greater detail. Labor regulation. In 1349, the King's Council passed an ordinance, and then in 1351 followed it up with a statute, the Statute of Laborers. Before 1348, before the Black Death, what labor control there had been by manorial lords on the basis of their own power. The common law hadn't given it to them. The common law had kind of grown up handling specific topics. It had never regulated the relations between lords and the unfree tenants, only between lords and those people who were holding free tenements. In other words, about a third of England. 2/3 of England were unfree, not slaves, but bound to the land, were unfree, and lords could control them. Remember when we said free tenement, that it had to be by certain services that weren't servile? If they were uncertain services that the Lord could demand more or less of, or servile in nature, shoveling manure or whatnot, those were unfree tenures, and the Lord had labor control over those. And he could handle that. But that was by status, wasn't it? The vital fact of labor control was whether you were free or unfree. If you were unfree, the common law didn't protect you, and the Lord, because he was the Lord, had that power. Not given by the common law, but just as kind of a bubble around which the common law had grown, which the common law didn't interfere with. You see the difference. It's not that the Lord had been given a power, it's that it had never been taken away from him. Okay. After 1348, because of the Statute of Laborers, you were going to, labor regulation took place by state control, completely ignoring status. Well, not completely ignoring status, but largely ignoring status. That control was exercised by JPs or by special commissioners to enforce the statute of laborers. And what had happened was that lords, the powerful people in the neighborhood, were made into commissioners. The same people who were powerful in the neighborhood before the Black Death were powerful in the neighborhood after the Black Death. But they were powerful in a different way. Instead of working on their own authority because they could control those people who were of unfree status, they could control everyone and enforce contractual obligations made by working people to work for a year on the whole population. Instead of on their own authority, they had greater authority by working as agents of the state. Okay? So that this gave them more power. By relying on the state, they were more powerful in the local area. The state got more power, obviously, as did local people. There's a tendency to think that, there's kind of a pie of government, that if the central government gets more, then local government gets less. That's often true, but it's not necessarily true. There are times at which the pie grows, and local power can increase at the same time that state power increases. And so what you had here was JPs or special commissioners, the local powerful people, now as agents of the state exercising more power over labor, not on the basis of status, on whether people were free or unfree, but basically on whether you were available for work. They were going to make you contract for your labor. If you were not fully occupied, you were available, and you would be forced to work. Now, that's wonderful for those local powerful people, isn't it? It gives them power, and it gives them the right to supervise. They are a genuine part of government at that point. Moreover, JPs, when they talk about reforming the JP system in England now, they're talking about reforming the 1361 statute. Law is long-lived in England. But those local people were given power to try crimes as JPs, finally in 1361. Those local people were thus brought into government in a very decisive way after the Black Death. More collegial kind of government for those individuals. To the extent that these local people relied on that statute to compel people to work, to that extent they no longer needed villain status. They had a more powerful option, didn't they? Villains didn't like being villains. They were restive as villains, as unfree. And increasingly lords manumitted them. And that wasn't only because the villains were demanding it, and it wasn't only because they had a more powerful bargaining position, which they did. There were fewer of them. They could bargain better. It's also, however, because now the lords didn't need it as much. When status was their only way to control labor, they would not have given up villains. When they can control free and unfree under the statute of laborers, status they can give away. And so increasingly from the Black Death to about the 16th century, villainage becomes more rare. By the 16th century, it's a relatively rare personal status. But that's because the state is so much stronger that local people, as agents of the state, can control labor in other ways. People see that dynamic? Bargaining power. People didn't like it, but it's also now expendable. You have other means of control that are more powerful. And so the villain status is no longer an essential part of labor control. Statute of Treasons of 1352. Prior to 1348, magnates and knights are becoming restive because Edward III, contrary to the way in which he's often portrayed, was a fairly oppressive person before the Black Death. His justices, with his approval, were messing around with those things for which they would give basically treason kinds of penalties, moving it up farther and farther. And for magnates, this is very troubling because if it's just a felony, and one of your tenants commits a felony, the king will take his lands, tenements, goods, and chattels for a year, and then the lands will lapse back to the felon's lord. But if it's treason, the king confiscates outright. And the justices were moving more and more things up to look like treason. Turns around completely after the Black Death. And you get the statute of treasons, which modern criminal lawyers, academic types, when they write about treason, they'll go back to this statute, and they talk about it as the great statute of treasons, because it defined treason. It defined it and made it clear and set limits to it. And that's the first time that had been done. For the magnates, this is wonderful, isn't it? It means that we're not going to manipulate the law for those maximum penalties. You will know exactly what the worst penalty situation is going to be. In other words, we're going to treat you fairly. We're going to treat you fairly. So they pull in the knights. They have the statute of treasons. There are lots of other things. I'm just kind of hitting the highlights. So before 1348, justices were expanding treason. In 1352, you get a definition of treason, defining it for the first time, limiting that offense quite clearly. Church and state. Edward III really had some problems with the church. He went through what historians call his anti-clerical phase for a few years after 1343. It actually was a bit longer than people think. He was accusing church officials of using their courts in arbitrary kinds of ways. And from about 1345, he got into a major conflict with at least 4 of his bishops about the right of advowsons, provisions to ecclesiastical posts. There were endowed ecclesiastical positions in cathedrals where the tenants didn't have to be there. And if you got control over appointment to one of those, you, of course, could take that person and use him as an administrator. And clerics, of course, were the people who could read and write best. And so those ecclesiastical positions that didn't require residence were prime mechanisms for supporting administrators, both for bishops and for the king, and lo and behold, for the pope. And it was the conflict between the pope and the king about who would control certain of those ecclesiastical posts that served as the focus of this dispute, because university graduates or other ambitious ecclesiastical people would go to the pope and get an order to the bishop to accept this person into the first ecclesiastical post that came up. The bishop would feel obliged and go ahead and appoint, and the king would feel that I could have had that one. And Edward III, from about 1345, went out after people who were getting what were called these papal provisions that would be an order to the bishop to accept this person into one of those endowed posts. And basically, it was just what the king did was order people out to search out people who had got these papal provisions and put them in jail. You know, no hearing, no due process, no nothing, just go out and do it. And there were 4 bishops that felt very pro-papal on this, that were willing to go ahead and take. The rest were willing to abide by what the king wanted, or somewhere on the borderline. But 4 of them were basically willing to fight. There were instances in which royal messengers brought writs to the bishops, and the bishop excommunicated the messenger and threw him in prison. There was a conflict before the chancellor while the chancellor was sealing writs in which blood was shed. They extraordinarily annoyed, and the Bishop of Norwich felt that it was prudent for him to go ahead and hide in his cathedral for 6 months without coming out. We're talking about people getting a bit tense. And indeed, what was happening was that Edward III was willing to use his courts to back bishops into a corner. And what he did was modulate what was happening in court. When the court got to a certain position and were unsure about what they should do, they would write to the king and say, okay, we're at this point. What should we do now? And the king would write back and say, yeah, go the next step. Okay, so the king was using court process to back those bishops further and further into a corner. And that process of litigation would end in taking all the wealth of that bishop, all the lands that made that bishopric wealthy. Okay, so just backing them and crushing them, basically. And he actually seized the temporalities, those lands of 2 of the bishops. The Archbishop of York finally just gave in and said, I can't take it anymore, and compromised. But what the king was doing was kind of bludgeoning them into submission using legal process that he carefully modulated. He followed it, ordered it, kept track of it. Okay? After the Black Death, he turns around. He turns around. He goes out in 1350 and undertakes to that bishop. He brings that bishop that had that had taken sanctuary in his cathedral for 6 months. He brings him onto the king's council, right into the center of government. He goes out and restores the temporalities that he'd taken from those bishops. The judgments that had gone against the bishops, in suits that had been brought by those messengers that had been thrown in prison, he said he'd go out and mediate. Of course, these are royal messengers. If the king tells them give it up, they're going to give it up. But he goes out of his way to go out and drag those people back in. To drag those people back in. Just like he'd done things for the magnates and the knights. He turns around completely here with the church, brings them back in, and seeks to compromise with them. And part of the compromise comes in the statute of provisors in 1351. That is where he gets the principle. In other words, you cannot go to Rome, to the Pope, well, it would be Avignon at this point. You cannot go to the Pope and get a provision to an ecclesiastical benefice. If you are, we will treat you as the king's enemy. That's what he'd been looking for, isn't it? That was his side of the compromise. But then in 1352, the statute pro clero was part of the other side. That gave up the method of litigation that would seize bishops' temporalities. It assured bishops that when they were indicted, they would be indicted for specific charges and not for vague things. It assured in many different ways due process for ecclesiastics that they drastically wanted. So the bishops got their side of it too. And then in 1353, the statute praemunire. The word praemunire means to warn. Remember I said that what had happened with those people who had got papal provisions before 1348, the king would just send out commissioners to hunt them down and imprison them? Well, praemunire changes that. Instead of just throwing them in prison, this says that you will give those people a warning of 60 days to show up and explain themselves. And if they don't explain themselves adequately and don't submit, then they're the king's enemy. Okay? But they get 60 days warning before being thrown in prison. That's due process, isn't it? You're going to get a hearing. You're going to get a hearing. You better not be on the wrong side of it. Or if you are, you better repent. This is major stuff. Praemunire will allow a person to go, a private person can bring this suit against someone. If you are thinking that you're going to be available to that post and someone else brings a provision from the Pope, you can bring the suit. And you can sue not only the other person, you can sue his lawyers, any summoners that he uses in court process, people who support him that aren't even involved in the litigation. You can sue everyone who's supporting him. And they can lose lands, tenements, goods, and chattels if convicted. This is a true bludgeon, isn't it? So much so that you almost never go to judgment in this. Eventually people come in and submit. Very few judgments in this kind of case. It's basically meant to control. But you see how that kind of balances between the king and those bishops. They get due process. He gets the principle. He brings them into the government. We're going to govern more collegially. They basically admit that he is in charge. And the king, after this point, has control over those ecclesiastical positions. That had been in dispute for more than 50 years. So, we've talked then about the way in which Edward III drew people in, right? We talked about the JPs and the statute of laborers that gave local people powers over powers of labor regulation by operating as agents of the state. We talked about the statute of treasons. We talked about the way in which he resolved his great difficulties with the bishops and the ecclesiastical sphere, so that he brought to an end that period of really great tension between king and bishops. By the way, in 1346, he was even excommunicated. He and his wife and all the justices and the chancellor were excommunicated right before he left for war and actually came home with a victory. If he had not had a victory, we might have heard more of that excommunication. Okay. That's the first part, drawing people together. Coercing the upper orders. This is the part, if one were a straight Marxist, you wouldn't expect this. You would say they drew together to control the workers. Right? Let's look at how they were controlling each other. First, we're going to talk about penal bonds. The law still talks about penal bonds. The UCC today prohibits them as unconscionable. Okay, so we're looking at something that today is prohibited because it's immoral. And it's been considered unconscionable since the 16th century. People thought they were immoral in the first half of the 14th century. With the Black Death, and up until the 16th century, they're a prime mechanism of the law. Okay, so we're talking about coercion. Let's look at how a penal bond is coercive. Okay, if I'm going to borrow $50, and I mean $50, from John Sharp, payable on the 1st of April, what I will do is I will admit in writing that I owe him $100, double the sum. Okay. On the back of that instrument, we'll have a defeasance, an unmaking of that bond that says if I pay John Sharp $50 by that day, then the obligation is null and void. Okay? See how that works? I admit double, and then on the same document, on the back of it, there's a defeasance, an unmaking. That is, if I pay what I really owe, then I don't owe the 100. That basically is my making myself liable to double the sum if I default. You see why we consider that immoral today? Why the Uniform Commercial Code prohibits those. You don't see... Pardon?
Don't you pay credit? It's the same thing. It's
But
like,
not double. Not
it
double.
It can be double. They charge.
It can work to double. Let me explain this to you. If you are 1 day late on this, you owe double. 1 day.
Our school works in that way.
It's effective, isn't it? Okay, this is about coercing people to stand to their debt obligations. Coercing people to stand to their debt obligations. You can even see the coercion in it. A very few of these had gone through the courts prior to the Black Death. Maybe one every other year, something in that order. And one has instances before the Black Death in which, in situations where I actually owed, it'd be 50 pounds, but I couldn't get a pound sign on the thing. So we'll say dollars. If I owed $50 and I had come on April the 1st and paid 30, okay, I tried. You know, I was there, I paid 30. And the court said, good enough. You go ahead and pay the other 20. And you're not going to have to pay the 100. That's fair, isn't it? You know, all you're really going to have to pay, if you paid some, is what you really owed after the Black Death. You pay 30 of the 50, and they'll subtract that 30 from the 100, but you'll have to pay the 70. In other words, before the Black Death, when these things were allowed in court at all, what they were really wanting to do was just enforce the actual debt. After the Black Death, you paid the penalty too. This is coercive. People see this. And these aren't used by your dirt peasants. These are major sums, 5, 6 pounds. An average working person makes about 2 pounds a year. 5, 6 pounds is about as low as you get. It goes into the hundreds. Okay? So major debts. These are all people in the upper orders. Knights, gentry, what have you. Earls, queen. And these are frequent. By 1400, this is the standard way for contracting a debt in a formal manner. This is how you do it. You do it by a penal bond. It's even the standard way as late as the 18th century. It's just that the court will always reduce it down to actual damages after the 16th. Okay? But this becomes the standard way. And the courts manipulate the process so that people think it's fair. Okay? For instance, in an ordinary debt case that's not a penal bond, if you have my written obligation with my seal on it, you sue me for the debt, I only have 2 responses. I can either say, ha-ha, I have a written receipt with your seal on it, or that's a forgery. I can't say just, I paid. Can't do it. They won't allow you to.
Why, after the Black Death, did the conditions become harsher when the financial...
To coerce people to do what they should. If you were thinking that you might die, are you going to just pay? And so to hold society together, law became much more coercive, battering you about the head to make sure that you were going to pay. Okay? So in an ordinary, just with an ordinary bond, you only have those 2 responses, don't you? Either I have your written, sealed receipt, or that's a forgery. But with a penal bond, without any written document, you can say, I paid. And this makes good sense. Because if in a regular bond, if you're suing me for 50 pounds and I actually owed you 50 pounds, it doesn't make any difference to me if I pay on time or not, because all you're going to be able to sue me for is what I owe you. And in that kind of situation, I can come with my 50 pounds, and I can say, okay, I want that writing back that I gave you, or I'm not going to pay you. And you'll say, okay, here it is. Okay? And that's fairly equal, isn't it? But with a penal bond, if I come and say, okay, here's the $50, and I say, give me the bond back, and you say, no, I don't want to. Can I just walk away? No, I'll then owe 100. It's a very unfair bargaining position there for me to get that writing back, isn't it? And so in that situation, the court turned around and said, no. There, you're going to just be able to say, I paid, and that will go to a jury. Okay? So they manipulated the process so that debtors would actually enter into these things. So it wasn't just coercion, it was carefully thought out procedure that would allow people to commit themselves in these ways and make the penal bond a primary form for contracting debts. People see this? Now this is coercion among the upper orders, isn't it? Okay? To make them do what they should.
Okay. Was it just between parties, or does it pass on to the heirs?
It will pass on to the heirs. You can make your heirs liable for this. In any bond. In any bond you can. You can make it that way. If you don't specifically make it that way in the bond, it will be against your executors.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Is this an exact contribution to later on land becoming a lien on certain loans made back then?
No. The history of that actually goes back before this. You can make land subject to specific debts in the reign of Edward I before 1300 by a process known as the statute merchant, in which you have to do that before officials and recognize that you owe and specifically make lands available for raising that money if you don't pay. And that's where that kind of thing starts. Okay, so penal bonds. You see, everyone sees how that's coercion of the upper orders. Can we have, okay, debt in lieu of charters. We've talked about the importance of instruments. For instance, with debt litigation, there are certain times when you can't even sue for land if you don't have a written instrument. So often it's going to be the case that the instrument is in the wrong person's hand. And this is going to be even more frequent after the Black Death. Imagine a situation, and this is going to happen with the Black Death quite frequently. I die. I have an important document. My wife has it now. She marries someone else, then she dies. Her husband, who has no relationship to my heir at all, has that document, right? And he didn't steal it. Every step of that was just what you would expect, isn't it? But now he has that document, and I need it back. And that's going to happen a lot when a lot of people are dying. So charters in the wrong hands are going to be a big problem right after the Black Death. The question is, how do you get those back? And the answer is with the writ of debt in lieu of charters. The problem with the way they'd been doing it was that, and we even have a case like this in the 1340s. What happens if I sue you for a document that I should have? The jury comes back and says, yes, it's mine, and you burn it. So rather than give it to me, you burn it. Okay? What's the court to do? Well, the whole remedy is about giving me back the charter, isn't it? And the court explicitly considers, well, what should we do? Should we give Palmer damages equal to what's protected? And initially they say, yeah, let's do that. And then they think about it and say, no, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to compel her to give the charter back. But it's burned. But the sheriff will go out and distrain her by 4 pence, 8 pence, 40 pence, 3 shillings, something like that. A little bit. Every, at max, 4 times a year. Now, you're not going to worry about that, are you? If what happens is you're going to be able to keep some land that's not yours because I can't sue for it because I don't have that charter, hey, you're going to commit that document to the flames. Yeah?
Without the document, how can you prove what's on the document?
Oh, I assert that in my pleading. and the jury confirms or not. It's hard, right? We're not talking about a lot of proof. We're talking about a jury siding with one or the other. Okay. Yeah.
So you're saying the witnesses to the signing of the document would be key, or would
No,
there
they
be
were often
witnesses?
included on the jury on the jury panel, but need not be. Need not be. If there were no specified witnesses, they wouldn't be there. It's basically just the jury deciding. Okay. After 1348, very rapidly, the court moves to change the kind of remedy they're going to give in debt and charters. And they change it to a vicious thing. In other words, if it's decided that that's my charter, the court's going to award that I will either get damages or the charter. It's your choice. You can give me the charter, but if you choose not to give me the charter, we're going to award the amount, the value that that charter protects. If it's a tenement, a piece of land worth 200 pounds, you'll owe me 200 pounds. Now, that doesn't sound coercive on its face, does it? But I don't have to show that I've lost the land. I can have the land. And all I want is my charter, right? All I want is my charter. You won't give it to me. No one's suing me, but you've got something that's mine. I sue you. I don't have to show that I've lost it or that I'm in danger of losing it. It's just that you've got my charter. You won't give it back. If you don't give it back, you owe me the 200 pounds. I have the land and the value. Is that coercive? What that's saying is, we are going to make you give those charters back.
It seems like that would be ripe for abuse because you could, you could.
Isn't all law? You rely on the jury and the court, don't you? You rely on the jury and the court.
Well, also just the fact that you could specify what was on that charter and no one would really know.
But you have to convince the jury, don't you? You have to convince the jury. All law is open to abuse. We're worse without law than with it, certainly, aren't we? And what it rests on is the integrity of the court, the integrity of the process, and the jury. Yeah? So, yes.
That person might not even have ever had the charter, and there may never have even been a charter.
Then the jury should not say that he's detaining it. The jury has to say that he's detaining it. I mean, if you accuse someone of assault, need that person ever have been there? No. And we can make false accusations today, can't we? As could they. Right? And so that's intrinsic in litigation, isn't it? A lot of litigation is just my word against yours. And we let that go to trial. Yeah? And so there's abuse possible there, but there's worse abuse if we can't. There's worse abuse if we can't. And the point that you really have to focus on here is that I can end up keeping the land and getting the value of the land too. Right? I don't have to show any real damage. It's the same kind of coercion that you see in the penal bond, isn't it? Coming down on you really hard to make you do what you should. Everyone sees that? Okay. A third thing. Partially coercive, partially facilitative. Chancery. You may have heard that Anglo-American law has courts of equity. Those aren't common law courts. Common law courts use juries, and courts of equity don't. Courts of equity have inquisitorial kinds of processes where the chancellor or his masters puts people under oath to ask them how they got the land, what they should be doing with it, whatnot. It's a system of fairness. It's a system of fairness that developed alongside the common law. Okay? And one of the reasons why it developed was problems with land. Before 1348, when a person died, his lands went to his heirs. His debts, as well as his chattels, went to his executors. Okay? So that you couldn't, unless you specified it in a bond, your heir was not liable. So you couldn't use your lands too easily to pay off your debts after you died. Right? There's that problem. Now, After 1348, increasingly, the law allowed uses. And uses are the antecedent, and for our purposes, they're not really the same, but they come close, are like trusts. In other words, you can appoint trustees to hold your land and do with it what you say. Okay? And one of the things that people very regularly used the use for was to pay their debts after they died. To pay their debts after they died. Or to increase the authority of husband and father. Intriguing. Because remember, we mentioned that a wife had dower rights. That's the land of her husband that she got to keep for the remainder of her life after he died. She would get to keep a third of his land for the rest of her life only after he died. Dower. Okay? Now, that only worked if you held the land at common law. If, however, the land was never yours, if you were never seized of that land, never lawfully possessed, your wife didn't get dower right. Well, what if you manage it so that just before marriage, you give your land to a couple friends on the understanding that they're going to do with it what you say? Well, they're lawfully possessed. It's not yours. You're just getting the benefit of it. And if in that situation, the wife doesn't get dower. People see how this works? Okay? Now, that means that the wife isn't as secure. That is, the wife will then depend, the widow's security will depend on what her husband tells his trustees up until the moment of death. Before this, at the moment of marriage, she was secure in her dower right. She knew what she would get, unless when he died, when her husband died, she was living in adultery with someone else. Okay? That would end the dower right. Short of that, she would get her dower. With these uses, you may never be seized of the land during the marriage. And if you're never seized of the land during the marriage, the widow does not get dower right. That puts immense power in the hands of the husband. Likewise, whereas the eldest son had been in a very secure position of being able to take by intestacy, because there were no wills of land, it would all go by intestacy. Eldest son takes all the land. Well, if the land isn't in your hands when you die, eldest son doesn't take it. You could rather tell your trustees, give it to my second son. Uses give a lot of governance authority to the male husband, father in a family. It increases the power of governance, doesn't it? It increases the power of governance in very coercive ways. In very coercive ways. And the way these were enforced looked abusive. In other words, the chancellor, instead of the ordinary common law process of summons and attachment and bring people in with distraints of 3 pence, 4 pence, 3 shillings, small sums, the chancellor would make people come in. He would issue an injunction. You be here on such and such a day, or you will forfeit sub pena under the penalty of 50 pounds. This is not a small sum. It's crushing. You be here or else. And once you get into court, you'll be put on oath and made to say how you got possession of that land. And this is how you control those trustees, call fefis to uses. You give them the land to hold to your benefit, and if they don't do it, you can go to the chancellor. Chancellor will haul them in with a subpoena and put them under oath, make them say how they got the land, that they're supposed to hold it to your benefit, and then issue an injunction on them, telling them that they must do what you say. That's good procedure, isn't it? Strong procedure. On the one hand, you're facilitating. On the other hand, you're coercing. It's both of those, isn't it? Okay, and the third thing, it's hard if you want prayers said after your death, if you believe that your soul might be in purgatory and you want prayers said so you'll go to heaven. It's hard just to give lands to the monks because you'll never know if they're actually praying. And there are ways of enforcing that, but it means that your son would have to keep going and checking. And is your son going to always go and check and see if the monks are praying when they should? Hard to, maybe for the first year, 2 years, 5, 10? You don't know. How do you handle that? Well, if you put the land that's going to go to the monks into a trust, a use, then you can specify to them that they will pay every year to those monks when the monks come and report that they prayed. No prayer, no pay. Are they going to pray? You bet. Okay? And then after a certain period, if they performed well and faithfully, give them the whole thing. Okay? Now, Edward III used this. Edward III used this for prayers to be said after his death. This is a real problem. How do you make sure those prayers are said? You use a use. Ways to compel people to do what they should. And these are all upper orders people, aren't they? Okay? So, after the Black Death, the upper orders coalesced into a governance structure to coerce each other to do what they should, and then to coerce the lower orders to do what they should. First, the coercion, statute of laborers. We've talked about the statute of laborers already, but let's talk a little bit more about what it did. The ordinance in 1349, the statute in 1351, its provisions applied to both free and villain, both free and unfree people. Didn't regard status. Okay? It compelled full employment. If you were over, the age of 14 and under the age of 60, and you were not fully employed, you were available. You were subject to these provisions. You were going to work, and you were going to work at traditional wages. Okay? So you were compelled to work. If you weren't going to work, you were in prison. So you were compelled to work, and you were compelled to work at pre-Black Death wages. Of course, when there are fewer people around, there's not as much work to do, but there's just about as much work to do. You're in a better bargaining position. This prevents you from bargaining, doesn't it? So you're going to work, and you're going to work at traditional wages. Worse, there's no time limit on the prosecution. Consider this. You're an 18-year-old. You show real promise. You're a good thatcher, say. You can really thatch a house. I hire you. And 2 months into the contract, you're supposed to work for me for a year. 2 months in, you get a much better offer somewhere else. Hey, you're not worth anything right now, are you? If I sue you, what do I get? Nothing. You know, I get the enjoyment of seeing you squirm. But basically, I don't get anything out of it. But I can control you. You know you're good. I know you're good. You say you're going to leave, and I say, no, you're not. Because you may not be worth anything now. But are you going to be worth something in 3 years, 4 years, 10 years? 10 years from now, I can come back on you if you leave now. 10 years from now, I can come back on you and strip you of everything you've accumulated. And we have cases brought 11 years, 12 years after the offense. Is this coercion? Okay. Let's see where we are. And it's enforced by government commissioners. It's state power, isn't it? It's state power. So you can see how the government's becoming more coercive. Quality of work. You tell me. If I tell you that you're going to work and you're going to work at traditional wages, what are you going to do? Not work very hard or not work very well. Englishmen today say job's worth. In other words, the job's not worth it. And so what are you going to, that's a big hole in that statute, isn't it? That's a big hole in that statute. It just says you're going to work at traditional wages. It doesn't say you're going to work well. Chancellor stepped in 1352, and then there's a lapse, and then again in 1358, and provided for writs that come to be called assumpsit writs. Assumpsit means he undertook. That reinforced the statute of laborers. The odd thing is that it's not about all undertakings. You could imagine something that was about all undertakings. But this wasn't. This was about people in occupations. It only went against people in occupations. It went against shepherds. I gave you my sheep to take care of, and you took care of them negligently so that they died. I can sue you. It handled carriers, carters who carried things by land, or people who carried things by ships. It took care of cloth workers. I gave you a piece of cloth to full, and you tore it apart. I can sue you for it. Quality of workmanship in people in occupations. Builders, you were supposed to build for me, and it starts out with a house. You know, you were supposed to build a house well and competently. You built a house and it collapsed. Okay? It starts out with that. As the years go by, and we're talking about 10, 12, 15 years, it goes to portions of a house, and then to kind of structures on the house like chimneys, and then to separate structures like dovecots or fountains that aren't attached to the house. And the Chancery is making these individual little decisions about situations in which workmen are going to be held liable for quality of workmanship. Starts out with houses, goes to chimneys, dovecots, fountains. With shepherds, it started out with dead sheep. Then it went to dead sheep and lambs. Then just lambs. You could sue just for lambs that were killed. Then for sheep and wool. Then just for wool that was damaged. Okay? All of these little individual decisions about expansion of governmental power to regulate people's lives, making available mechanisms whereby individuals could sue others to enforce labor law. Okay? Private litigation to enforce public policy. Doctors. For horses or people, this is where medical malpractice starts. And it doesn't start, basically, I came to you with my hand half cut off and hanging just by a tendon. Okay? I don't see how the people survive, but there are lots of these cases. You said you would make it better. It's here, and it's not working right. So you didn't do what you said you were going to do. My opinion is at that time, darn lucky that they're still alive, but they didn't seem to think so. Medical malpractice. You did not do what you said you would do. And you can be sued for it. And likewise with doctors for horses. Okay? Assumpsit. Going against people of occupation to make them work well. Yes?
So what if you said you couldn't do it? I'm not sure if I can put your hand back together. Are you off the hook?
It's always on an undertaking, isn't it? It's based on the undertaking. Yeah, I can do that. Mind you, how many people are going to negotiate when they're coming, you know, they got a hand hanging just by a tendon? Are you going to sit there and negotiate hard? We don't know really how essential it was to prove that undertaking. If you think about it for 3 seconds, you think that a lot of times there's no real undertaking at all. Yeah? But it's based on an undertaking theoretically. Different kinds of things. Trespass on the case handles well, they'll look somewhat similar. But here's an instance that isn't. Scienter. We still have this remedy at law. If I keep an animal that I know to be vicious, scienter means knowingly. Okay. If I keep an animal that I know to be vicious, and it accidentally gets loose and savages you or your animals, you can sue me for keeping that beast. It's not that I set the animal, my dog, on your sheep or on you, but I knowingly kept a vicious beast. In the beginning, it's all dogs, just dogs. Okay. In other words, I shouldn't be keeping dangerous animals, should I? And the law is going to come down on me for that. Before this, we don't know how that was handled in England. What I suspect is you were supposed to carry your knife with you. And if there was a vicious dog, you killed it. Self-help, basically. Now you can sue. Now you can sue. In addition to scienter, there's an innkeeper trespass on the case writ that says basically whereas according to the law and custom of the realm of England, people who are common innkeepers and hold themselves out to keep people's goods safe by day and night are obliged to keep those goods safe without loss against any outsider. And why, considering all that, you, a common innkeeper, took my goods for safekeeping when I stayed at your inn. Some outsider broke in, stole my goods. You're liable. Okay? An innkeeper is liable for the goods of his guest against theft by outsiders. Innkeepers hate this. We can prove that this is coercive. In most other cases that we have, 9 out of 10 cases disappear before pleading. You know, it's just process. 9 out of 10 of them just disappear. Innkeeper writs, these are people with money. 95% of these go to pleading and out to jury. Just an amazingly high percentage of persistent defense of these cases. They hate it. Why should we be held liable when we had a safe in and someone just breaks in and steals the guest's goods? They don't like it at all. They feel it's coercive. smiths. If I give you my horse to be shoed, and you drive a nail into the quick of the horse's hoof, you're liable now. Before this, smiths had a privilege. In other words, if you put a nail into my horse's hoof, I couldn't sue you in any way. You were privileged against litigation. That doesn't mean that nothing would happen. It just meant that government didn't stretch that far. Government didn't just stretch that far, and basically the market took care of it. Not because they were not because they were Chicago school free marketeers, but just because the government didn't do certain things. The market would handle it. If you were a smith and you put a nail into my horse's hoof, you might compensate me. You might compensate me because I'm the local wealthy person, and you know that if you don't compensate me, you're in big trouble socially. You might compensate me because you're a good Christian, and I'm a poor widow, and you've taken away my only livelihood, right? You might compensate, but you don't have to. And if you lame too many horses, there are a lot of smiths around. I can take my horse somewhere else. Market can handle it well enough. After the Black Death, skilled laborers are hit in the same proportion as the rest of the population, but there are approximately the same number of horses and approximately the same number of wealthy people riding good horses. There aren't as many skilled people to shoe horses. We know this from London. London expressly in 1354 has major problems with this. Smiths are now made liable. We've got cases in which people were basically using practice horses. Not just one nail into the quick of the horse's hoof, but 3 or 4 into the quick of the same hoof. Liable even for one nail. Okay? So, obliged to do what they should. Now, look at that again. What you see there is a massive amount of litigation, about twice as much litigation per person. The kind of things that make up that greater amount of litigation, how can we account for those? We account for those with penal bonds, a large portion of it, prosecutions under the statute of laborers, assumpsit cases, trespass on the case cases. Uses, of course, go over to the chancery. That's a whole other branch of court that we don't even see in this chart. Okay? A lot of statute of laborers things happen down at local level before the JPs. Some of it can happen up here in the central court. What you're seeing is a massive amount more regulation. What you have now is a government of inherent authority. What does that mean? It means that you have a government that for the first time is acting in fact as being responsible for the social needs, whatever they are, as they arise. A more fully empowered government, one that can handle social needs. Do you see how that's different? Now we can go through and just kind of link this up to things that happen afterwards. Here's a comparison of what we had before. The one on the right is a medieval state, what we did in the first part of the class about a bureaucracy benefiting a large sector of society, generating loyalty to the central government that's more important than loyalty to family, locality, or religion. Now incorporating that whole portion of the medieval state. You don't jettison it. It's still there. That whole structure is still there. But now you're acting with a state that regulates much more broadly in society. It goes down deeper into smiths and cloth workers and shepherds, trying to handle all those levels of occupation. If you look forward then at things that happen after that, because you're really building, just like you don't notice a great deal of difference in 1180, but you notice a lot in 1350, things keep growing. Well, after 1381, about 30 years after the Black Death, you can go forward and look at other things. In 1381, there's the Peasants' Revolt, objecting to the poll tax, but also to the statute of laborers prosecutions. They hated that thing. They killed the Chief Justice of King's Bench and the Chancellor, who was also the Archbishop of Canterbury. They knew what the problem was. It was the law, and they were going to go out after it and eliminate it. Look at that saying that they had. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? class sentiment if you ever saw it. Right? They know that the law is coming down hard on them. They know what the statute of laborers is doing. They were put down. They were put down, and people always think that nothing was really done, but it really was. A little thing, 1382. Assumption, instead of just handling occupation kinds of things, began to handle warranty situations. I warranted that the horse I'm selling you was good and a workable horse, but it was sick and died. Warranty obligations beginning to be handled by assumption. Not just occupation. The occupation stuff stays there, but they add on a broader segment. By 1389, villanage tenure, those tenements that weren't affected by the common law, can now be used as a defense. In other words, there is now some protection for all tenures in England, whether held freely or unfreely. It's not very good protection yet, but it's some. The common law in England is now not only for just free tenements, it will take recognition also of unfree tenements. This is making the common law relevant not just to that top third, but also to the whole of England. This is important about how they were looking at the nation. This is the government acting more broadly in society. In religion, the Lollards, heretical notions about lay control over the church. John Wycliffe, who started this, grew up under Edward III's anti-clerical phase and became an Oxford professor. An Oxford professor at the time when they were going through provisors and praemunire. He was looking at what was actually happening and thinking about lay control over the church, but going farther than the king was willing to go. But the reaction to the Lollards is increased royal power. 1401, you get a statute a parliamentary statute that allows the king's courts to burn heretics and to suppress heretical literature. King's council becomes expressly involved in enforcing right religion. This is expanding government's power over a broader area of social life, acting as able to regulate the whole of society as necessary. This culminates under Henry VII, Henry VIII. From really 1495 in Henry VII's reign, the common law once again expanded dramatically, taking away most of the jurisdictions that before had been handled by the church courts, just assuming those jurisdictions, suppressing the jurisdictions of ecclesiastical courts by allowing people to sue others for prosecuting them, okay? Going out and viciously eliminating ecclesiastical court jurisdictions, bringing it up into the king's court. In 1529, during the Anne Boleyn affair, the king went out in Parliament and restructured parish life, doing what medieval ideals had indicated, compelling parish priests to be on their parish. If they were absent for more than a month or at a time or 2 months in a year, the penalty was £10 for every month's violation. You can just see the parishioners sitting back there and saying, how long can I wait before someone else sues? Okay. The point seems to be about £40. But enforcing a parish priest residence in the parish so that they weren't off somewhere else, keeping them out of all kinds of economic endeavor. They were supposed to be involved in spiritual things only. They had similar penalties for buying and selling for profit, couldn't do that. For running any kind of business, couldn't do that. For holding rental land, couldn't do that. And that was a vicious penalty. There you had a penalty of £10 a month plus 15 times the profit you got from the land. I have a case in which the parish priest got 1 shilling, 1/20th of a pound profit, held it and got that over a year. He was sued and lost £120 for 12 months violation, plus 15 times that 1 shilling. Okay? Vicious kinds of things. But 1529, Parliament goes out, restructures parish life, takes control over the clergy. In 1534, Henry VIII becomes head of the church. There you have a king, then, who is in control of both church and state. That is the point at which you have a complete government of inherent authority, isn't it? You have a government that, in fact, that in fact controls and regulates the whole of society. So you see how you have a growth from a feudal monarchy, then to a medieval state, and finally to a government of inherent authority. Each successive step building on the other. Not discarding it, but building on it. So state authority becomes increasingly stronger. These are labels you can use, not because they thought that. You didn't find Henry VIII thinking, government of inherent authority, or Edward III. But it's a label that an historian can use to go ahead and summarize all kinds of things about that society so that you can compare and keep those in mind. Labels are wonderful things, as long as you don't think that they're true.